Welcome to this explainer. Okay, if you were anywhere on social media in early 2024, you definitely felt the panic, right? Viral posts had us all thinking there was a dangerous stranger lurking around literally every corner. But what happens when we just tune out the hype and look at the hard facts? Well, today, we're breaking down the actual data on homicides in Kenya to uncover the real Mtaa reality. So get ready, because the truth is absolutely going to surprise you. Think back for a second to those terrifying headlines from the start of the year. We were getting bombarded with stories of alleged serial killers, horrifying discoveries in quarries, and this sudden, really chilling fear of booking short-term rentals and Airbnbs. It kind of felt like the danger was always a stranger, waiting in the shadows. And look, while those individual tragedies were absolutely real and devastating, relying only on headlines gives us a super distorted view of the bigger picture. Today, we're going to funnel down from all that media-driven sensationalism straight into the actual crime scene data collected by the Directorate of Criminal Investigations, the DCI. Okay, let's dive straight into our first massive reality check. According to the 2024 DCI data, out of the 1,011 recorded homicide cases that fit the legal definition in Kenya, a staggering 70% of the victims were actually men. Women accounted for 30%. Now, given the intense media focus on the tragic killings of women, this might sound pretty shocking, but the data doesn't lie. While the nature of violence against women has specific horrifying characteristics that we will absolutely cover today, the sheer volume of homicide victims in Kenya is overwhelmingly male. Now, when we compare the victims to the perpetrators, we see this tragic mirror image. The vast majority of the victims, young men. The majority of the perpetrators, also young men, specifically between the ages of 20 and 40. To put that into perspective, out of the known perpetrators, 630 were male compared to just 88 females. So the core Mtaa reality, the everyday reality of the streets and neighborhoods, is largely a story of young guys killing other young guys. And check this out. Out of those 1,011 total homicide cases, do you know how many perpetrators were actually unknown to the police? Just 149. That's it. That means in the vast, vast majority of these killings, the killer is not some random boogeyman or a stranger jumping out of a dark alley. The killer is almost always someone the victim knows. It's a friend, a neighbor, a business partner, a sibling, or an intimate partner. The danger, statistically speaking, is right inside our own circles. Moving on to Section 1, Mapping the Violence, Eastlands and Private Spaces. So if we know who is involved, the next logical question is, well, where is this happening? The data is incredibly clear here. Homicides are highly localized. In Nairobi City County alone, a massive 70% of homicides occurred in these specific areas: Starehe, Kamakunji, Kariobangi, Kayole, Mathare, Embakasi, Jiru, and Kasarani. And what do these areas have in common? They mostly make up the Eastlands of Nairobi. They're predominantly poor neighborhoods and informal settlements. This right here is the daily Mtaa reality for countless youths. You've got high population density, intense economic stressors, and limited opportunities, creating this pressure cooker environment where simple disputes can quickly turn lethal. But, there's a really chilling contrast to that street-level hotspot data. While young men are mostly dying in the streets of those informal settlements, a significant number of homicides, particularly the killings of women and girls, are happening in supposedly safe, private spaces. We're talking about family homes, rental apartments, hotels, and increasingly short-term rentals like Airbnbs. The violence here is hidden entirely behind closed doors, often perpetrated by intimate partners or acquaintances in settings where the victim really thought they were secure. This timeline really brings that private space violence into sharp, devastating focus. Early 2024 saw a horrifying trend emerge that completely gripped the nation. On January 7th, Starlet Wahoo was tragically stabbed to death in a short-term rental in South B by a man she actually accompanied there. Less than 2 weeks later, on January 19th, 20-year-old university student Rita Wainey was brutally murdered in an Airbnb in Kasarani after being lured through Instagram messages. These cases highlight just how intimate and digitally facilitated this violence against women became in the data. All right, Section 2, the drivers: love, land, and money. So we know the who and we know the where. Now we've got to look at the why. What are the daily frictions that are boiling over into deadly violence? Let's start with relationships. I want to read you this really stark quote straight from a DCI officer in the report. They said, "Killings of women almost all the time involve a love triangle, especially among students, and alcohol is often a trigger for the killing. In Nyeri, a few women have been killed while coming from clubs, but when we investigate, it's always a love triangle.
This really grounds those statistics in a grim reality. So much of this violence is rooted in toxic relationship endings, perceived betrayal, rejection, and crimes of passion, and it's heavily fueled by alcohol. But outside of romance, the absolute biggest driver by far is land. Look at how this escalation plays out. Across the country, unresolved family land disputes and succession issues are just tearing families apart. You literally have siblings, cousins, and even children fighting elderly parents over property. Now, normally you'd think, okay, take it to court, but the judicial process is often incredibly slow, sometimes taking decades, and honestly, it's way too expensive for the average citizen. So what happens? Ordinary neighbors and relatives feel they have zero other options and they take matters into their own hands, pushing disputes straight into deadly violent conflict.
And this brilliant insight from a Narok judge shows exactly how this land dynamic plays out in rural and border areas. The judge noted, in this county, men aged below 34 are the most likely to be killed, and it is normally over grazing land disputes. These incidents frequently happen when the victim and perpetrator are drinking. It's sudden, it's an escalation over resources like grazing space or farming land, and it's usually not premeditated at all. It perfectly explains why so many young men are losing their lives in these specific regions.
Finally, let's look at Section 3, the system, the police trust gap.
So we've talked about the people, the places, and the triggers. But what actually happens after a crime is committed, or when someone is threatened? Well, the report meticulously documents several huge systemic barriers to justice. First up is the overwhelming public perception that police require bribes just to investigate a threat. Whether that's real or just perceived, it completely destroys community trust. People simply stop reporting. Second is a massive lack of investigative equipment. And third, because people don't trust the police to handle things fairly, we see a terrifying rise in mob justice, where the public just takes the law into their own hands, which obviously further perpetuates the cycle of violence. To illustrate just how dire that equipment situation actually is, consider this shocking fact pulled directly from the report. An entire county DCI unit might literally lack a single vehicle to get to a crime scene, or even a basic camera to document evidence. I mean, how can we possibly expect thorough, timely justice when the investigators are radically unequipped like that? This directly leads to poor evidence gathering, premature termination of investigations, and ultimately perpetrators just walking free.
Which brings us to the end of our explainer today, and to this final, really provocative question. We've seen the data. We know the viral myths of lurking strangers are mostly just that, myths. The statistical reality is that most homicides are young men killing young men in informal settlements or intimate partners committing violence behind closed doors. So if the danger is most often someone we know, inside our own communities, and the system is currently struggling to support us, how do we change the entire reality? It's a question that demands we really rethink our surroundings and start looking seriously at community-led solutions and mental health support. Thank you so much for joining me for this deep dive into the data. Keep asking questions and keep learning.